Thank you very much, Long. And yes, this forum existed for at least 30 years or more, 35 probably. And it had, originally it was called the GPAX Forum. Then it became the International Studies Forum. And I guess I didn't realize that the International Studies got away, is not there anymore, sorry. Okay. So, all right. This is a more like I'm an economist who is doing primarily sort of mathematical game theory stuff. So this is sort of like this is more of a presenting some of the essence of this approach that you have, the economic rationalist approach, but also provides some critiques and criticisms and everything that we have. Okay. So here is a quote from a former president of the United States who used to be a general in the Second World War. And it was just around the end of the Korean War that he talks about it. And he says every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. Right? This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hope of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron, right? That's very difficult. I mean, you would expect an anti-war kind of activist to say those things, right? And they are true, right? What he says is true. Then the question is, then, why is there a conflict, right? You have conflict among individuals, groups, or states, both because from a rationalist perspective, both for the money you spend on arms, you cannot eat or consume tanks and F-16s, and the destruction and the collateral damage that, so to speak, that's used comes about. And the puzzle has two aspects. First of all, why arm? Why spend the money on arming? Sort of, which is, even if you don't have war, why spend all the money that you have? And if you arm, or if you don't, or whatever, why do you fight? Why do you actually take the chances to go and fight with uncertain outcome and additional costs that you will incur, right? So today, then, I will first talk briefly about the consequences and costs of conflict. Then I will introduce this economic rational approach and the way you can use it to answer these two questions, the why arm and why fight. And then provide caveats and criticisms of this, of the rationalist approaches that you have, right? So just the types of conflict conflict can be, you have international wars, internal conflicts in terms of civil wars and conflicts, gang and mafia warfare, crime and other violence. But you also have down to the household level, right? Domestic violence. And you can have non-violent conflict. Arguments, emotional abuse, influence activities, and competition on the job is sometimes that there are types of conflict that sometimes we use that in language. So, but although what I have to say will I will basically discussing mostly the issues of wars and internal conflicts that we'll be discussing today. Okay, some of the effects of wars. For example, in civil wars, since World War II, you have in more than a third, 40% of the countries around the globe, with at least 20 million deaths and other large and direct economic costs. You have, even for the estimates of the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, just to the US, not to the Afghanistanis or Iraqis, which have been tremendous, right? It has been $4 to $6 trillion as of more than 10 years ago by Stiglitz and Bilmes, two economists. And $4 to $6 trillion then were about a third to 40% of US GDP, right? So that's sort of, and that's immense cost. And that includes not just the direct cost, but also, say, the cost of taking care of veterans or those who have PTSD and other sort of economic costs that includes, right? And you have, of course, other effects of wars on death, slavery, torture and injury, sexual violence, PTSD, that has been it's always been there. In terms of other costs, you have, for example, military expenditures is about 2.4% of world GDP and varies from less than 1% to more than 10%. You have internal security costs, including what you have, civil wars and everything, the distributional and social conflicts that you have between from strikes and lockouts to protests to military coups and other kinds of rivalries. You have different ways of things, and in the US you even have what is called ghost budgets. Even for 20 years there were $100 billion or more in the US that was appropriated for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that was not even accounted by anything. There were no checks in any sense of the way that accounting checks. I mean, these are money that went to build ghost hospitals in Afghanistan, for example, right? Ghosts in the sense they were never built, but somebody got the money for building them, but there was no way of accounting for them, right? So these are sort of things. So these are the costs of conflict are tremendous, and the question is then why do you have conflict, right? So just to talk about in terms of what do we mean by the rational approach to understanding those things, and what do we mean by rational action? Here are two economists who are talking about it, that they define when referred to a rational action by an agent, we require that action to maximize the expected payoff to that agent out of the available actions and relative to the agent's beliefs about the potential consequences of the actions. This does not necessarily require that the beliefs be accurate, nor that the payoffs of the individual agent correspond to what is best for the state or country that he or she might be represent. So that's sort of, it's rational action relative to an actor who might not be representing the collective interests or in any other way, or the beliefs that might not be right. Or another way to think of it is that in conceptualizing rational action that way is to ask who are the actors who are involved, right? So we have the US executive, Saddam Hussein or the Taliban are sort of the main actors that you conceptualize. And what are their available actions, strategies, and tactics? What can they do? Sort of the US executive could, in the case of Iraq, sort of first impose the choice of action, of sanctions, the level of sanctions, or no sanctions, a possibility, and the level, and then invasion, and what kind of invasion, and what kind of post-war plans. All of those things could be taken into account as being the available actions on the part of the US executive, the president, and those around him. And then what are the possible outcomes as a result of the actions of each actor, depending on what the US does and what the Iraq, how the Iraq reacts and what are the actions, you have an outcome. You have, the outcome might be probabilistic in the sense you don't know what it will end up with. Are you going to have, you could have some in the US believing that the final outcome would be a win for the US and democracy for Iraq. Or another outcome is what happened, right? There was some kind of Pyrrhic victory for the US and destruction of Iraq and instability sort of for Iraq. But anyway, sort of what, in many ways, what you have is that the framework that you use, the frame of mind, the model that you use, doesn't have to be right. It can be wrong, very wrong, right? Sort of. Actually, there were 3 economists from the University of Chicago before the Iraq War who made the cost-benefit analysis, tried to make a cost-benefit analysis of invading Iraq or not. And they came up with a very sort of positive sort of cost-benefit analysis, right? Sort of that was, and if you read it now, and this paper was published as a chapter in a book, and it was interesting to see what the assumptions that they were making, the framework they were using. Okay, so that you have. Okay, now sort of in using a rationalist approach, you can think of this as there are 2 ways of making a living: producing or trading, what economists usually examine, or taking things away from others and defending others taking things away from you. Sort of that's when you allow for this possibility, then you might have then the answer to why arm, all right? So that might be an answer, right? But then how far do you go using sort of the issue of taking things away from others, and how much do you arm? How do you limit that, right? And the problem that you have is the problem of commitment is that you do not arm or fight unable to write sort of a contract, a disarmament contract with someone. It's very difficult to do usually, unless you have sort of the modern state's claims to legitimate monopoly of violence that you have, right? And you have this security provided by the state that could limit internal arming internal to a country. Okay? You still have anarchy, absence of centralized rule at the international level, and that's constrained by norms, institutions, and this international law, and bilateral, multilateral agreements, but not anybody having hegemonic, legitimate monopoly of violence. So, so here you come to the limits of rational choice, and you can sort of compare 2 societies, hypothetical societies that are in 2 opposite ones. One is what is called a cross my heart society. And that is a society in which if you cross your heart, then it's a perfect commitment that you will not steal or do anything from others. That it's a perfect commitment that you are a saint, and everybody in that society is a saint. And in that society, nobody arms. Nobody sort of does anything bad. The other society is a Hobbesian jungle. War of all against all. There you have to expend your resources on sort of arming and everything. And these are two extreme societies. Given the same resources, right? Which society is better off? Cross my heart society, of course, right? Well, what determines, those two, usually you don't have societies sort of on one extreme, sort of, especially cross my heart societies, there are very few. But this kind of thought experiment gives you the idea that norms about how people behave with one another, conventions, moral beliefs, serve at least partially as commitments instead of a contract, disarmament contract, right? And that has been the case for most pre-modern societies, that they had been, that you had these strong norms and conventions that do not keep, they prevent a Hobbesian jungle. In some cases, it can be almost like a cross my heart society, in some cases. And that's sort of something that it's very difficult. These are sort of more like constructivist kind of approaches to that critiques of rational choice, that with rational choice, you cannot really determine completely, at least, whether you are in a Hobbesian jungle or cross my heart society, where you fall, all right, in one or the other, or in the middle. I mean, there are some attempts to do that, but it's very difficult to do that within a rational choice framework. Well, now, why fight? The question then that comes up is that we talked about arming, right? Okay, conditional on having a certain amount of arms. Why would you want to fight? Right? Why would you want to do it? And for that, from a rationalist point approach, you would compare, well, the benefits and costs of peace, right, like my fellow Chicago economist did before the Iraq War, to the expected benefits and costs of conflict. Right? That's sort of the thing. So conflict usually involves much uncertainty and risk compared to peace. Right? You don't know whether you're going to be on top, or whether you will win or not, and what does the win mean, and there is all sorts of issues that come up. And given also that the war, conflict, fighting involves additional costs that are also uncertain, why would you want to do it, right? Why fight? And you can sort of think about just how you construct a sort of a framework to think about those issues. You can think about a conflictual setting, and you have the two sides make choices between guns and butter, sort of the thing. Butter is an economic good or a combination of goods. Guns increase your chance of winning if conflict were to take place. And how much butter you can keep away from your adversary, or how much butter to extract from your adversary under the threat of conflict. Sort of these are that's sort of the case if you have conflict, you have fight. Or if you don't have a fight, you can use guns to increase your bargaining, negotiating sort of position that you have, sort of those things. So that's sort of what is the framework that you can use. There are some, and this can be, you can think of it, this protocol of moves, of thinking, could be repeated time after time, year after year. And whether you have conflict or peace under the threat of conflict will be resulting. I'm not going to go through the pictures, just I could have gone. Well, what are the incentives for peace and to bargain and settle in the shadow of conflict? Well, you have distraction and other costs brought about by war that we talked about. And those are uncertain, right? Bombing of factories and houses and everything. You also, whoever makes the decisions is, you have risk aversion. You don't want to take chances. You can be pessimistic about things. And there are other sort of economic reasons that we have here, complementarities in production, sacrificing gains from trade, and those things. So before World War I in 1914, you had a period of globalization, the first, depending what you call it, from 1870 to 1914, you had the era of globalization, that international trade as a share of total GDP for the world was higher than it was until the early 90s, right? So that was a period of globalization. And everybody depended, I mean, it was saying trade. You have German bankers in London and British traders everywhere, and French sort of doing investments everywhere, and so forth and so on. And in 1913, there was a book called The Great Illusion that was arguing that there is no chance, there was no chance of war, because who will want to sacrifice the gains from trade, the globalization, the blah, 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 everything, sort of this, okay? So, the incentives, the seeming or apparent incentives not to fight would seem pretty strong. Well, one can make some sort of rationalist arguments that have been used to why there might be a case that one side at least make a decision to go to war. And that's what is called asymmetric incomplete information. You don't know the other side's military capabilities, objectives, or other predispositions. And what if your adversary is strong when you think they are likely weak, and you take a chance, a calculated risk to do that? Right? Sort of that's one sort of thing that has been discussed. You can be optimistic or have risk-seeking preferences, and especially young males tend to have risk-seeking preferences, sort of in many ways. Okay? And there are other sort of things, but there are also the difficulty in committing right and enforceable contract to levels of arms. And that's true actually for declining powers versus ascending powers. And that has been discussed recently as the Thucydides trap, as they applying to the case of the US versus China, in the sense that declining power might want to instigate war in order to reduce the chance that it will be in a disadvantageous position in the future. Sort of that's sort of something that has been discussed. The inability to commit to a bargaining outcome. Suppose that you make a sort of something that you make a deal, okay, I'm going to pay you off in order not to fight with me. But then you come back and say, well, I need more money, or something like that. So that's one sort of way. Well, this would be the case, these rationales would be the case if there might be sort of things, but are they enough? Another possibility is the question that called the cui bono, or who benefits from this. The interests of leaders, of those who make the decision about wars, right, are not the same. They don't have the same interests of the constituencies necessarily, of the population or the country, right? And there is the tendency of having that the leaders benefit more from war than the average member of their constituency. That's sort of the tendency to think. So you had European rulers from the late Middle Ages to more recent times. They were gaining, if they won, they get the loot that they were going to get. If they lose, they were not usually losing their lives. I mean, it was actually very untypical to lose their lives at all. They were knights and sort of aristocrats who would respect each other's lives, right? So there was loot, but then the cost of warfare would go mostly to the population at large. And generals and political leaders during the World War I, for example, all right, they were not going to lose their lives. They were ordering sort of thousands and millions, actually, of soldiers to go to the war, but these were like chess pieces for them. Right? So that's sort of an important part of in understanding why they might be fighting, is that who benefits. That's the key to there. Who might, with interests that are very different than the interests of the general population. Right? That's sort of an important, even in supposedly democratic societies, polities. Right? And especially because what happens is that the interests, those who know, I mean, the general population doesn't know much about foreign policy because it doesn't directly concern them about like making a living today. But those who have an interest in foreign policy might have they have concentrated interests. It affects their either their professional lives a lot, or they have an outward orientation for the rest of the world, especially during imperialism, for example, right? They were, those who made the most were the British sort of, those who instigated a lot of the wars. They had strong interest. The East India Company, they were making a lot of profits, for example. And now you have the military-industrial complex in the US that has a vested interest in perpetuating wars. Right? And they have an inordinate influence in decision-making about foreign policy and about wars. So what are the caveats to the rationalist approaches? That I think it provides you some understanding, especially what we just talked about, who benefits. That's the important question to ask from a rationalist approach, as well as other approaches, right? Now, one of the issues is that often all possible outcomes and the probabilities of are known by all. Sort of that's one kind of limitation that you have. And especially, what if some outcomes are not conceivable? They are unknown unknowns. There is complete unawareness what might come about. And Daniel Ellsberg, has anybody heard of Daniel Ellsberg? Okay, so he was an official and in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, he was part of the, he was the military, he was part of the foreign policy military establishment. He was a very smart guy who increasingly became disillusioned with the Vietnam War and with the general attitude of the US at the time. And in the early 1970s, he leaked the so-called Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, and that provided information, inside information about what was going on actually during the war that was very different than what was reported in the press. So he was also involved with nuclear planning. He was as part of the Rand Corporation. And for example, at the time, it was not known that the effects of fires induced by nuclear blasts would lead to what is nuclear winter, that actually could lead to the death of the whole Earth, north-south hemisphere. There are still debates about what the probability of that is, but at the time it was not even conceivable. They thought nuclear war would be more like, okay, very strong kind of TNT kind of bombs, right? With some sort of effects maybe like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was not sort of something that could wipe out the whole Earth, right? But this is not much different than what we think about it now, because I think a lot of people are unaware that nuclear war, what nuclear war means too. So maybe it's sort of not dissimilar to what we have today. Even some political leaders that think that nuclear war is winnable, okay? So that's one of the problems of that. You have confident men or women who think they know how the world is and what will be the effects of a nuclear war or something else, right? Or my Chicago colleagues, University of Chicago colleagues, thinks, well, it's a cost-benefit analysis, I'm sure. I mean, it's going to be a cakewalk, and Iraq, sort of everything will be fine, sort of we're all fine, all right? Without taking into account a lot, and others could have seen then that they were not taking into account a lot of known unknowns. They were not taking into account known unknowns, in addition to the unknown unknowns who they might have not known, right? So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, does anybody know what the Cuban Missile Crisis was? Oh, okay. So this was the US put nuclear missiles in Turkey, and without anybody knowing it, but the Soviet Union learned about it. And then in retaliation, the Soviet Union decided to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Then the US blockaded Cuba and said, if you don't take the missiles out, then we'll have nuclear war. And then a deal was made, and I understand that actually President Kennedy went against the advice of some of his key advisors, or the consensus of his advisors, to negotiate with Khrushchev and actually have the Soviets take away the missiles from Cuba, and quietly the US take the nuclear missiles from Turkey, right? So that was the deal, the Cuban Missile. In the meantime, the world was awaiting the possibility of nuclear war, and there were sort of things. Well, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, while this was going on, and the blockade on Cuba was in place, there were Soviet submarines going around as well, that the US fleet considered that that it was completely a belief that these submarines did not have any nuclear weapons, and the US were throwing depth charges against the Soviet submarines in order to sink them, in order to hurt them. But these submarines had nuclear weapons, and they were ready to launch them against the eastern seaboard in the US. And it was just happened that there was one admiral in this particular submarine who needed a key. You know, there were 3 people from within the Soviet submarine, and one disagreed, right? And that's what prevented nuclear war. In addition, and that would have happened without sort of, regardless of what agreement Khrushchev and Kennedy, JFK made, right? So that was another unknown from the point of view of US ships that were blockading Cuba, because, oh, there is no chance. I mean, these submarines don't have nuclear weapons, right? They assumed that. And there were other things like that Daniel Ellsberg commented, that Pacific commanders, they had to right to launch nuclear weapons without authorization. That's not unknown, but it was sort of something else that had to do with the fact that in the up to 1960s, you cannot communicate effectively through radio all throughout the world in the Pacific. And the Pacific commanders, because of that, so the Pacific commanders, if they thought that there was war going on, they could have launched nuclear aeroplanes, nuclear planes in around South Korea, from South Korea, and from Japan against both the Soviet Union and China, actually. Yeah. So these are sort of one of the things. Another caveat. Okay, so these are sort of some of the issues we talk about. And what I would like to emphasize that the situation today is more dangerous, probably, arguably, than it was during the Cold War. But there is a lot less concern. At least there was some concern in the 1960s and 70s about, but there is no concern. And, and what happened is that these concerns, both in the US and Europe and the Soviet Union, induced to have the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the INF Treaty, the START Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, that all of them do not exist today. And that's what makes it more dangerous today, but we don't talk about it. We're not concerned. GPACS was founded because in the 1980s, people were, at UCI were concerned with nuclear war. There is absolutely no sort of concern now. Right? And that's interesting, you know. It says something about our frame of mind, about our model of the world, right? Our model of the world, our frame of mind today is about nuclear war is unthinkable, right? And it is sort of interesting. Well, another issue that is difficult to take into account on the part of rationalist approaches, but they could be accommodated, is the issues of identity based on religion, ethnicity, race, class, or ideology. And that can obviously also be, and it could be more important actually than all the material payoffs that we had discussed up to earlier. Right? And moreover, these issues of identity have a reverse effect of conflict, making identities more salient in many ways, right? So a lot of the modern nation state, the way it has been, modern nation states, a lot of them have been forged. You know, they have made identity more salient through war, actually. So there is an argument by Eugene Weber, for example, that the French peasants did not become French until World War I, until they went to war and they felt French, even though they had the legacy of Napoleon and revolution and sort of they were the first country in the world that used, in modern times, that people willingly went to war for their country. You know, having people who are not having professional soldiers, who were at the time true, but the American Revolutionary War was the one that forged American identity in many ways. That was they were the 13 colonies, and they were, you know, they were all, at least the elites were British, they didn't think of themselves as different until, you know, whatever, they started thinking of themselves as both separate from Britain and as something different, right? American, whatever. And that can be used as a strategic use of identity by external actors in order to create new ethnogenesis in some ways, right? Sort of things. I'm originally from Greece, right? And there is actually I have a colleague who argues, I'm not sure about the hypothesis, I mean, he has a hypothesis, for example, that modern Greeks became modern Greeks because, partly at least, because Catherine the Great was at war with the Ottoman Empire and sent a fleet around the Baltic down to the Aegean and instigated a revolution in the 1780s that made salient the modern Greek or Greek identity or whatever, and that's for example. I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's very difficult to argue. Maybe there are other events, you know, how you can have ethnogenesis or something. Okay, so anyway, there is no single explanation for fighting, right? You can expect multiple causes for all of those things, and you can use, say, the World War I and see that there are many, you know, despite the argument that was made by Angel about the impossibility of war before 1914 because of the interdependencies and everything, how can you make sense of it? And historians keep talking about it, and they will continue talking about it, but there is no way to decide that there is one cause, or I mean, at least many of those, all of those have been argued to have played a role. The asymmetric information, time lag between announcing general mobilization and readiness that I was talking about at the time because of the way that it took some time to bring troops to the forward. So whenever you had someone do something, you'd better start before you are not ready. Perhaps optimism on some sides, the ascending power that wanted more natural resources to have the right to have colonies versus the declining power Britain. The politicians and military leaders' biased benefit and cost posture that we talked about earlier, sort of that was, they were not bearing many costs and the benefits were different, right? Fighting the last word, sort of in the sense that's the unawareness that, the fighting the last war was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, where it was very decisive, it happened very fast. But what happened in 1914 and afterwards? Well, it was trench warfare. They could not move. That was not conceivable at the time. They didn't think, nobody thought that could have been the case. It was the unknown of the time, right? And identity, of course. The French crowds in Berlin, in Paris, were thinking they would be in 2 weeks, they would be in Berlin, and the crowds in Berlin thought they would be in Paris within 2 weeks, and all their problems will be solved. Right? So that's sort of the thing. Okay, let me conclude then. Arming and wars, of course, are very expensive, can be addressed by rational approaches, about the second way of making a living. And we talked about why arm and why fight. The limits of rationalist approaches have to do with the frameworks and models of the world as preconceptions that you have. That norms, conventions, beliefs can make one more warlike or less warlike, and you have different societies, the cross my heart society versus others, so those things can play a big role. And the role of identity, of course, is sort of important in this. But the identity itself is endogenous to other factors. Okay, so that's what I had to say. Yeah. Thank you.